beginning a series on financialization
with a parable about Tulipmania, the 17th century financial bubble around tulip speculation in the Netherlands. Seems rather cliched, but I'm going to do it anyway.
1. Because all the windmills and tulip fields seem like they'll be fun to draw and animate. And 2. Because it demonstrates a wider point about how economists talk about more modern financial crashes, which is, nobody agrees what's going on at all. Many of the key themes in debates around more modern financial crashes can all be seen in the arguments projected back over the centuries onto analysis of Tulipmania. This video is going to be accompanied by a longer blog for anyone who wants to go a little deeper down the rabbit hole. Primary sources are limited. Many contracts were not written down, and even when they were mostly destroyed. Further, there were no regular newspapers which covered the crisis as it happened. Instead, most records come from legal documents around disputed contracts, and from critical pamphlets put out after the crisis, warning against the evils of speculation and materialism. But this is what we do know. Tulips were a luxury item, bought at immense prices by the wealthy, but particularly tulips infected with the mosaic virus, which led to distinctive stripe patterns on the petals. Initially, merchants who traded in these tulips were relatively well informed, often visiting the gardens in which the tulips were grown, and trading took place at times of year where flowers were in bloom, and so the characteristics of different bulbs could be observed. This trade was centered in the city of Haarlem, but was spread out over a wide range of smaller towns and cities. However, over time this changed. More and more trade was done in the winter, before flowers had grown. Basically, contracts were signed where sellers and buyers agreed to trade bulbs at a future date at an agreed upon price, long before the bulbs actually grew. More and more people joined the market, often with less information than the earlier tulip traders, and lower quality bulbs began to be traded in bulk and by weight. Prices began to grow faster and faster until eventually they crashed. Unlike modern markets, which are very interconnected, information took a while to travel, and so rather than happening instantaneously, the crash rippled out day by day from major centers to small towns. To avoid catastrophe, futures after a certain date were converted to options, basically meaning buyers were allowed to opt out of their previous agreements to buy bulbs at now inconceivable prices, and only required to pay a much smaller settlement fee, about 10% of the agreed upon price. The effect of this bubble bursting were rather contained, compared with the dire warnings found in religious pamphlets describing it. Although the odd trader may have been plunged in debt and ruin, for most, tulip contracts formed a pretty small part of their overall income or investment portfolio. However, there is a debate about whether there was a bubble at all. That is, whether non-financial factors, called fundamentals, drove the sudden inflation and collapse of prices, rather than speculation. Garber, and later Thompson, argue that there's really nothing to see here, and everyone is just making a fuss over nothing. Some rich people just like flowers a lot, you know. Just leave them in peace and stop judging them. Novelties and luxuries have always commanded high prices. Good seed stock is often very expensive, because it can be used to grow more. This is actually what happens with a lot of new exotic flower breeds, and nobody calls that a bubble. Further, wars going on between other large tulip-growing nations in Europe changed both supply and demand conditions in sudden and unexpected ways. They both make some concessions that towards the end there were some poorly informed and speculative buyers, but this, they argue, was a small minority and explains relatively little of the overall price pattern. Thompson also argues that although officially most of the contracts looked like futures, everyone was actually just treating them like options, and that the difference between the two instruments both decreased the damage of the resulting crash and made sense of some of the very high prices which these de facto options were traded at. The fact that buyers could basically default on options once prices collapsed did give them an out, so it's clear that this reduced the damage. But the argument as to why the conversion of futures to options would cause prices to skyrocket is a bit beyond this video. I do go into a bit more detail about it in the blog. Veen argues against this modern reinterpretation, maintaining that there was in fact a bubble, although less destructive than initially portrayed. He argues that both Garber and Thompson use the limited available data in ways which smooth out the volatility. Garber through linear interpolation between existing prices, and Thompson by constructing an index linking all tulip prices, which is bad because all of the relative prices of tulips are constantly changing. He then argues that it was a close social link between traders, both created the bubble and allowed for the transformation of futures into options once prices collapsed. Many traders within towns belonged to the same community, were part of the same religion. Most tulip trading was done in Mennonite communities, and often were linked by marriage. This meant that most traders had a high opinion of other traders, and trusted their decisions. As more people began tulip trading, this meant that most people were relying on the opinion of friends and family, who they trusted, rather than knowledge of the underlying value of tulips.
So, tight-knit communities with high levels of trust are actually part of the issue here, because many traders would make much more reasonable decisions if they viewed other traders with suspicion and skepticism. Putting this in context, liberals tend to believe that markets process information efficiently, and successful capitalists invest wisely, if ambitiously, in line with their own estimation of the fundamental value of goods, and consequently, financial markets need only minimal social oversight and control. In contrast, Keynesians view financial markets as inherently unstable and in need of state intervention to run efficiently.